Hey there! So the Nikon ZR got announced overnight, and it is a really interesting release. I've seen a lot of videos out there talking about the camera, and there's been a lot of opinions being thrown around all over the place, so I just want to share my thoughts about the camera because it's pretty fascinating and quite different. Now, disclaimer here, I don't have the camera, I've never touched it, I've never used it, so I'm basing all of my opinions and thoughts on the ZR after watching other creators' videos and looking at the specs and also my experience using Nikon cameras. I've tested and reviewed many Nikon cameras, including the Z8, Z6 III, ZF, Z50 Mark II, and it's all documented on this channel. I do currently have the Z9 on loan from Nikon, so huge thanks, Nikon. I'm intending to do some wildlife filmmaking and some tutorials and stuff on this camera in the next few months, so huge thanks to Nikon. All right, what is the Nikon ZR? It is the first Nikon camera where they incorporated some of the RED technology, and this is coming after they acquired the RED company about a year and a half ago. Now this camera, the ZR, is co-branded on the back, Nikon and RED, and it's also the first camera in the Z Cinema line. So this is a totally new kind of product for Nikon. This is really interesting. It's a super compact, full-frame mirrorless camera with the usual Nikon menus and operating system, and it has the 6K sensor out of the Z6 Mark III. It has IBIS, no EVF, and a huge, beautiful 4-inch LCD screen. I hope everybody, and by everybody I mean the other camera manufacturers, are motivated by this to make larger LCD screens on their future cameras, because now that I'm seeing this on a small body camera, I don't know why all the other manufacturers aren't doing it. We all want better LCD screens, so great job, Nikon. So now let's talk about the codecs. And these are going to be very similar to the codecs that are in all of the other recent Nikon cameras, and they did add one additional codec, which is the star of the show here. It's a new RED codec, which we're going to talk about here. If you're unfamiliar with the codecs in the other Nikon cameras, there are a few options. There is the 12-bit NRAW, there's high and normal quality, there's 12-bit ProRes RAW, 10-bit ProRes HQ, so there's no other flavors of ProRes like ProRes and ProRes Lite, and there's also a 10-bit H.265, and keep in mind this is a 420 codec, not a 422 codec. Now I've talked about this in length in some of my other videos about Nikon that I really wish they had a 10-bit 422 H.265. The only way to get a compressed 10-bit 422 codec is shooting in ProRes HQ, and the only option is HQ, so very high quality, but also extremely large data rates. So if you're shooting in N-Log on any of the recent Nikon cameras, and this goes for when you're shooting in NRAW or any of the other codecs, when you're shooting in N-Log, it has a color gamut or color space of Rec 2020. Now Rec 2020 is a very common color space, but it's not nearly as large as some of the gamuts in the other camera manufacturers that are out there. And when you have a larger color space, when you're recording a larger color space, you capture more color information, which is better for the image. And a great example of this is Fuji. Now Fuji had F-Log, and then they had F-Log 2, and then they came out with F-Log 2C. Now F-Log 2C has the same log curve or gamma as F-Log 2, but they added a larger gamut, a cinema gamut that captures more color information. So Rec 2020 is a little bit limiting, and so adding the new RED RAW codec in the Nikon ZR will add log G3 G10, which has the red wide gamut RGB color space. This is awesome, much larger color space, and it will allow you to capture more color information. This is great. Now, the new codec that I keep talking about here is called R3D NE. Now, it's a 12-bit codec, and I think a lot of people don't know about the data rate or bit rate of this codec, and that's kind of what I want to talk about here, because I think it's a little bit surprising if you didn't really dig into the specs and may not have been covered by all of the people reviewing the camera. Now, unlike R3D, which most people are comfortable with if you've shot on a RED camera before, or at least know about it, it has different levels of compression. There's HQ, MQ, LQ, and ELQ is the newest one they added. And they have different amounts of compression, so different amounts of data rate or data that you're writing to the card when you're recording in those modes. Now, when you use the Nikon ZR and record in R3D NE, it only has one option for compression level. You don't get to choose. So let's talk about the data rates for the R3D NE codec. When you're shooting in 6K 60, it records at 3,780 megabits per second, which is 1,701 gigabytes per hour in 6K 60. So if you're using a 512 gig card, you only get 18 minutes. That's not a lot. That's a lot of memory to be capturing. And if you're shooting in 6K 24, it's 1520 megabits per second, which gives you 684 gigabytes per hour. And that will give a 512 gig card lasts about 45 minutes. Keep that in mind here. So if you're just shooting 6K 24 in the R3D NE, you don't have an option to lower the bitrate or increase the compression. 684 gigabytes per hour. That's a lot of data. So for comparison, if you're shooting on the Red Komodo in 6K 24 in R3D, if you choose the HQ compression, it's 239 megabytes per second, which is 1912 megabits per second. In an MQ, it's 168 megabytes per second and 1344 megabits per second. So in 6K 24 on the Nikon ZR, you're sitting between MQ and HQ. And I think that's got to be something you have to consider, that you can't control the compression. Maybe they do add that later in future firmwares. That would be awesome. But for right now, keep in mind, like if you're doing any sort of long form recording on this, or even medium form recording, the data is going to be absolutely massive that you're going to have to record. Now, if you've ever shot a Komodo, you really know how big these files are. And a lot of people tend to use LQ or ELQ for things that's other than like super high-end projects. When I had the Komodo, I usually shot in LQ or ELQ unless we're doing something crazy, because the data, it just becomes massive. Okay, so this camera, the ZR, has high bit rates. I know I went on about this for way too long probably. So what? Well, let's think about the price of this camera and what the camera really is and who the camera is marketed towards. Now, on the surface, people will think, man, I can get a camera with R3D and red color science in it with IBIS and autofocus, etc. for $2,200. Yes, that is all true. You can get that in the Nikon ZR, but this is not a production camera. Now, look at the size of the camera, the shape, micro HDMI, the awkward memory locations, etc. And I haven't seen any reports of overheating on this camera, but I'd personally be a bit suspicious for long run times in the heat and humidity, since it's a tiny body without active cooling. But maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe people aren't going to be doing long form recording on this. Again, who is this camera for? This is not a FX3 killer. Can we just all agree that we're getting sick of seeing that in titles and thumbnails on YouTube and just move on from that? This is more in line with, in my opinion, the original Blackmagic pocket camera, like the OG Pocket and the Sigma FP, etc. Those kinds of cameras. This is a very powerful, pocketable video camera with some really heavy codecs and a fantastic image quality. Now, I wouldn't want to use this for my client work or my personal content creation because of the data rates. Now, after watching Gerald Undun's review, which was a great technical breakdown, by the way, thank you, Gerald, if you are watching this, he showed a few things. Now, first of all, he vastly preferred the R3D NE Codec over everything else in the camera. Not surprising. Also, the dynamic range was a lot lower than expected or advertised, and this was not surprising to me, as I've used the Z6 Mark III, which has the same sensor as the ZR, and I've always thought the dynamic range was lacking in that camera. But for most people buying this camera or wanting to buy this camera, the R3D NE Codec is why they are buying it. Remember, R3D in red color science for $2,200. That is pretty cool. Again, this is all fine. This camera probably isn't for you, and that's okay. I think that all of the nerdy filmmakers and videographers out there were hoping for a red camera under the hood of a Nikon body. But when Nikon bought red, I know a lot of us were initially very shocked with the news, but then we started imagining all of the possibilities of the merging of the two technologies. Like, for example, I had these conversations with some friends where we're like, imagine if they put a Raptor sensor inside of a Z9. You know, that stuff does sound a bit crazy, but I definitely remember having these conversations, and we started getting really excited about the merger. Now, a year and a half later, I think a lot of us were hoping for the first release to be sort of like a FX3 C50 type camera, or maybe another box style camera with a red sensor, an R3D, and take some of the amazing user interfaces from Red, like the traffic lights, which are a great exposure tool, the phone app, etc. Those are some of the things that make Red red, besides just R3D and the color science. Now, those things that I'm talking about, those are Red cameras, not Nikons. Will we see this stuff implemented into the future with Nikon cameras? I really hope so. Will we see a production-ready Nikon video camera in the future with all of the best of Red and Nikon? I think so, and I hope so. Now, this is a camera that is made to use basically as is. It has a large LCD screen, it has IBIS and a heavy codec for fancy color grading later. Now, you can take this camera, walk around with it. It's tiny, just put a lens on it and capture some great images, again, with the red color science, which I personally love, having owned and used a Komodo. Now, I don't think Nikon meant for the users of the ZR to rig this up. This camera, in my opinion, is to entice people into the Nikon and Red ecosystem. Get them to buy lenses and then future cameras, get them used to shooting in R3D, and really get them hooked on that R3D raw workflow, which is amazing. Now, the ZR could definitely be used as a B or C cam to some Reds. I think that's definitely a possibility. It could also be put in some small spaces for creative shots, so it could be cool in those situations as well. Now, personally, I would have rather seen a higher end, more production ready camera, like I was mentioning before, maybe with the Z8, Z9 sensor in it, for example. That sensor is absolutely amazing. And I think if you implemented some of the red technology with a Z8, Z9 sensor, it would be awesome. Now, this is just the beginning of the Nikon's Z Cinema products. And I personally can't wait to see what Nikon brings out over the next few years. I can't wait to see the cool stuff that people create with this camera, because it brings some pretty powerful tools down to a lower price point. I also see this as a really fun camera to use, and most of the videos I saw, people were having a blast shooting with it because you can get a really strong image in a really tiny camera. And this may not be a camera that you need to buy, but it is a pretty cool start for Nikon Z Cinema line, and I can't wait to try one at some point. So anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.